Well, this morning we are going to continue in our study of the book of Esther, and we've reached chapter 5, and that is our reading this morning. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace, in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall, facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out to her the gold scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. Then the king asked, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom will be given you." "If it pleases the king," replied Esther, "let the king together with Haman come today to a banquet I have prepared for him." "Bring Haman at once," the king said, "so that we may do what Esther asks." So the king and Haman went to a banquet Esther had prepared. As they were drinking wine, the king again asked Esther, "Now what is your petition? It will be given you. And what is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted." Esther replied, "My petition and my request is this. If the king regards me with favour, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for them. Then I will answer the king's question." Haman went out that day happy and in high spirits. But when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence, he was filled with rage against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. Calling together his friends and Zeresh his wife, Haman boasted to them about his vast wealth, his many sons, and all the ways that the king had honoured him, and how he had elevated him above all the other nobles and officials. "And that's not all," Haman added. "I'm the only person Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to the banquet she gave, and she's invited me along with the king tomorrow. But all of this gave me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate." His wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, "Have a pole set up, reaching the height of 50 cubits, and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai impaled on it. Then go with the king to the banquet and enjoy yourself." This suggestion delighted Haman, and he had the pole set up. Amen. And may God bless the reading of his holy word. Well, I wonder how many of us here today enjoy baking. Any bakers? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, there's 6. There's a few of you there. I wonder how many of you have ever baked a birthday cake? Yep, I think the majority that actually raised their hands for baking. Well, I want to tell you a story. Lorna tends to make birthday cakes in our family when a birthday comes up. And for James's first birthday, she wanted to bake James a cake. And this is it here, which is a pretty nice cake. James loved it. Ate loads of it for just being one. But when Lorna set out to do it, she got all her ingredients, the eggs, the flour, sugar, and get it all ready into a cake batter and put it into the oven. Now, our oven is quite funny and quite difficult. It takes much longer to cook than stated on any cookbooks or any recipes. So when it's time to see if the cake is ready, Lorna has a dilemma on her hands. Does she go in and check and run the risk of the sponge deflating, or does she wait it out and hope that the sponge won't burn. Timing is everything. It needs to be exact or the cake will be ruined. Does Lorna get impatient and take matters into her own hands and check? Or does she wait it out? And that is a question for us this morning. Timing. Is it too early or too late? If it is too early or too late, it can have a bad outcome for the thing that you're waiting for. And in our passage this morning of Esther chapter 5, we're going to be thinking about timing and being patient. Last week, Derek spoke to us about how Esther and Mordecai found out about Haman's evil plan to kill the Jews. And they started to devise their own plan to try and save their people. And this morning, we're going to be dealing with the first part of their plan. The author of Esther tells us that Queen Esther waited 3 days before she put on her best clothing and started to loiter in the king's hallway, hoping that her presence in the king's hallway might mean that King Xerxes would summon her to his presence. Now, at the time, this was extremely risky because no one could just walk up to the king without being invited. Usually, this strategy would end up with someone losing their head. And indeed, in the historical records, there is a man in the king's court that his job was to lob people's heads off. That was his role. It was almost a full-time job of actually just lobbing people's heads off. So it was risky. I've actually lost my place. I'm just going to see where it actually was. However, this incident, in this story today, it worked. And Xerxes was pleased to see Queen Esther summoned to him. And at this point, the king asked Esther what she wanted, even up to half the kingdom. And to her surprise, the queen invited the king and Haman to a banquet she was throwing. The author then tells us that the queen saw that Esther was kind of bothered or wanted something because he asked her again. And she invited him to another banquet the next day. And at this point, the author switches the story's main character from Esther to Haman. And initially, Haman is walking in air. He loves that he is in an inner circle. You can imagine that he's all smiley and googly-eyed because of how important he is that he's been invited to a private dinner with a king and queen. He's in cloud 9. And then he sees Mordecai. And he falls back to earth with a huge thump. He controls himself until he gets home. Then he calls his wife and closest friends around him and boasts to them to try and make himself feel better. But still, Mordecai is spoiling his groove. He's like a stone in his shoe or a seed in his mouth. It just won't go away. It's so niggly and annoying. So he comes up with an even more wicked plan just for Mordecai and makes a pole which is 23 meters long, which he's then going to impale Mordecai on. Like so often in this book so far, the author of Esther is comparing and contrasting the characters of the two main protagonists of the story. In this chapter, it is between Queen Esther and Haman. And it's now to these two characters that we're going to turn. We're going to begin by looking at the character of Haman. I know that Haman is an evil guy in this story, but a part of me feels maybe a wee bit sorry for him because it must be so difficult to be Haman. The story tells us that he's been having a great time. He's been invited to a private dinner with the king and queen. And in that day and age, there was nothing more important than that. For us, it would be like us being invited to a famous musician or film star's house. I'm not sure who your favourite actor or actress is, but for me, it would be like being invited to Denzel Washington's house for dinner. I would love it. I would feel special and honoured to be there. For Haman, he would have felt the same. But he believed that he deserved it, that he was due this privilege and honour because he was the second most important person in the whole kingdom. However, Haman's sense of pride had gone from that kind of healthy sense of being proud of your achievements and proud of your work, being diligent in your work, and it moved to an unhealthy pride, centered on entitlement and self-centeredness. And the reason that we can say this is that there's three things we notice about him in chapter 5. Pride, when it's unhealthy, takes offense easily. And we can see that with Haman. Haman just has to see Mordecai. The author of the story doesn't tell us if they interacted or, anything like that. Just the sight of Mordecai offended Haman. Pride takes offense easily. So that's the first thing. Secondly, pride is emotionally volatile. Haman is emotionally all over the place. He goes from having the best time in his life to a fit of rage within a second because his emotions and sense of worth are tied up in things that can change easily. So secondly, pride is emotionally volatile. Thirdly, pride finds its boast in self-performance, one's performance, possessions, and position in life. Mordecai's medicine to feel better after seeing Mordecai was to gather his friends and his family round and boast about how important he was so he can start feeling better about himself. So that he can compare himself to others around him. So the third thing is, pride boasts about one's performance, possessions, and position in life. Haman's sense of pride makes him rash and volatile. He goes from being extremely happy to the pits of despair in a second. And the ultimate reason behind this is that his identity is built up around his own power and strength. In Haman's eyes, no one is giving him the honour and respect he is due. So he has to make it happen under his own power, which means that he has to react to every situation and moment as it comes to him. This course of action means that he's constantly having to fight fires everywhere he sees them, and that makes him rash and volatile. If Haman is running all over the place, demanding respect from people, the complete opposite would be Queen Esther. Let us not forget that Esther knows that she and her people are in imminent danger. And if she doesn't find a solution to Haman's evil plan, that would mean certain death. Now imagine if Haman found himself in that situation. He'd be running all over the king's court in a fit of rage with everyone. However, Esther is a complete opposite and acts very calmly and rationally in the face of such danger. After Esther and Mordecai find out about the plot in chapter 4, it would have been easy and understandable for Esther just to have gone straight to King Xerxes and told him the whole thing. But Esther didn't do that. She held her nerve and trusted that God would provide the correct time to say to the king. Just like James's cake at the opening of the sermon, Esther waited for the perfect moment to ask the king. Too early or too late? And that would definitely have resulted in death for Esther and her people. But Esther trusted in God and knew what he was doing, and that allowed her to remain patient in the face of death. I'm sure her heart was pounding, and she would like nothing better to blurt it all out to the king. But Esther remained calm and measured in her reactions because she trusted in God. And it is quite a comparison to Haman's rash and emotional actions. Esther could rely on something outside herself. She could rely on God, who knew what was best for her and her people. And for us today, for Christians who believe in Jesus, we also have that ability that we can trust in God rather than ourselves. And trusting in God means that God is stable. Whereas people that don't trust in God are like Haman. They go around trying to fix things themselves. Throughout this book so far, Derek and I have repeatedly stressed that although God is not directly mentioned within the text, he is working and acting behind the scenes of the book. And this chapter is no different. Esther could have easily just told the king everything in the hope that he would be on her side rather than on Haman's. But Esther trusted God and that his timing was perfect. And this is a repeated theme throughout the Bible, where God asks us to trust him and put our faith in him and that he knows best. Many of the issues within the Bible happen because the people involved don't trust God or his timing. They believe that he's taking too long. In the case of Abraham and Sarah, God promised them that they would have a child, but they couldn't wait long enough. And so what did they do? They introduced Hagar into it, trying to accelerate God's plan. Or they believed that God was acting too quick, so they tried to put the brakes on God, thinking of the Israelites. Waiting to go into the promised land, they send in 12 scouts to see what the land had, the army and the infrastructure. 10 of them said, we need to wait. God's moving too quickly here. These people are too strong for us. Only 2 says, no, we trust God, we go in and we take the promised land. However, in all of those situations where people have taken matters into their own hands, it has resulted in bad things and bad outcomes for those involved. They have trusted their own judgment and timing rather than trusted in God and that he knows what he is doing. I wonder how many of us have done the same thing in our own lives. We have believed that God is being too quick, so we delay what we know he wants us to do. Or he's being too slow, so we take matters into our own hands and try and work it out for ourselves rather than trusting in God. Many people in our society today believe that God is a giant killjoy, who is a God of no's and a God of restrictions. However, they are misinformed. God is a God who knows best and wants the best for us. And there's reasons why he says no, and there's reasons why he may delay things. We need to trust him even against their own judgment. Chapter 5 of Esther is a story and a lesson about God's perfect timing. We need to be like Esther rather than Haman, trusting in God and his timing rather than being Haman and running around trying to make it happen under our own steam. Amen.